Tonight, Bibi's private war. The Israeli prime minister is unraveling. His war cabinet is divided, his people are revolting, and his army is retreating. Yet he continues to threaten an offensive. Is Benjamin Netanyahu losing his private war? That's tonight on Narrative. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Narrative. We invite you, as always, to support our programming by joining up at Substack or Patreon for as little as $8 a month. Gaza families slowly trickled back to towns and neighborhoods today that were left nearly uninhabitable by the intense bombardment over the last 6 months. They're confronting the daunting task of rebuilding their shattered homes and communities, with entire city blocks reduced to rubble and critical infrastructure heavily damaged. But amidst all the destruction, a question looms. What prompted the sudden shift in the conflict from escalating violence to troop withdrawals and hostage negotiations? The cracks in Israel's war coalition began appearing in the hours after Netanyahu's announcement last week that the IDF had killed 7 aid workers from World's Central Kitchen.
Unfortunately, in the last day, there was a tragic incident where our forces unintentionally struck innocent people in the Gaza Strip. It happens in war, and we are thoroughly investigating it. We are in contact with the governments and will do everything to prevent such occurrences in the future.
That callous reaction to the World's Central Kitchen murder came just days after the United States abstained from a UN resolution warning Israel against attacking Rafah. The resolution enraged Netanyahu, but surely not enough to act out in a very public way like this. Whether he was directly involved or not, Netanyahu's dismissive initial response to the loss of 7 aid workers fueled outrage against him. Within hours, the IDF issued a very different-sounding apology, a public apology for what happened.
It's very difficult for people to draw the conclusion that this was a grave mistake and not something else.
What else could it be other than a very grave mistake, Kamali? I mean, we do not target intentionally, and the forces on the ground didn't target intentionally. They were under the misunderstanding that these were Hamas because they identified gunmen in and around those vehicles on top of one of the trucks, even actually firing. And so it is an absolute tragedy. It's something that needed to be and should have been prevented, as our Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Zev Shalev, said yesterday morning.
For Chef Jose Andres of World's Central Kitchen, as for much of the rest of the world, this was a turning point. Israel, he says, no longer acts in self-defense.
The initial report released Friday calling the drone strikes a grave mistake that should not have happened. Satisfied with that report?
Well, I want to thank, obviously, the IDF for doing such a quick investigation. But at the same time, I would say something so complicated, the investigation should be much more deeper. And I would say that the perpetrator cannot be investigating himself.
They say that their drone video, and this has not been verified, this video, that they say shows Hamas operatives, and they thought one fired from an aid truck.
Every time something happens, we cannot just be bringing Hamas into the question. This is not anymore about the 7 men and women of World Central Kitchen that perish on this unfortunate event. This is happening for too long. It's been 6 months of targeting anything that seems moves. This doesn't seem a war against terror. This doesn't seem anymore a war about defending Israel. This really, at this point, seems it's a war against humanity itself.
The forces shaping this conflict are complex and multi-layered. But at the center is Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the 74-year-old hardline leader of Israel, who's been the prime minister for 16 years over 3 terms in office. Netanyahu has also been a constant figure in the United States since the 1980s, when he was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. Tonight, we'll revisit his term as a UN ambassador, his ability to manipulate the US media, and his close friendship with Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father. Netanyahu is also very close to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, which has earned him a place in the strongman club of wannabe authoritarians, like Viktor Orban and, yes, Donald Trump. So who is the real Bibi Netanyahu? A pragmatic Israeli leader, an aspiring dictator, a friend of the United States, or an ally to Russia? That's the question we're asking tonight, because the answer is crucial to what happens in November. The stakes could not be higher, not just for Gazans and Israelis, but for freedom-loving people around the world. If the Israeli people allow Netanyahu to keep his grip on power, they may well be the enablers that shift the balance of power towards the East and away from the West, towards authoritarians and dictators and away from democracy. Rick Petrie is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's an expert on the energy sector, but has become a well-known influencer on Twitter. He's also the co-founder of Global Power Partners, and he joins us tonight. Rick, welcome back to the show. It's so good to have you on. You've been a regular contributor as we've been seeing the crisis unfold in Gaza, so we certainly are happy to have you back here tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Things have evolved quite dramatically in the last few days. It seems to be a very different mood from Bibi Netanyahu and his war cabinet since the attack and the murder of 7 aid workers involved in the World Central Kitchen. Tell me a little bit more about how you think that event has changed the dynamics of what's going on and the trajectory of this conflict we're seeing in Gaza.
I guess my feeling is that, at least with respect to world opinion, that event has both solidified and accelerated a feeling that was, in any case, already strong around the world, and that has now crystallized on a bipartisan basis, certainly in the United States, and I think it's true elsewhere, that the conduct of the Israeli operation in Gaza after October 7th has been a dramatic overreaction, or that the application of force against a largely civilian population, amidst whom undoubtedly Hamas fighters were embedded, has not been just or justifiable. And Israel was therefore already feeling the heat. I think World Central Kitchen killings, particularly as the details of it came out, that it wasn't simply a single blunder. It was a series of 3 strikes on 3 vehicles that were spaced widely apart. And as they hit the vehicles one by one, the occupants of those vehicles ran from one damaged vehicle to the next, only to be bombed again there. And the explanations that have come out, that IDF spotters had identified 1 or 2 gunmen who were around those trucks at one point or another, and then some reports say left the trucks and went to some warehouse. None of it really, I think, is very persuasive in mitigating what is, at least at the battlefield commander level, a very bad blunder or mistake.
Do you think perhaps it was more than that? Do you think this was an intentional attack on this organization? Maybe what preceded that event, just by a couple of days, was voted by the United Nations, not vetoed by the United States, a resolution against Israel and calling for a ceasefire. That just was the immediate predecessor, or the previous event that happened to that World Central Kitchen killing.
Yeah, I don't dispute that. That's entirely possible. Also, the record overall of aid workers and members of the press having been targeted and killed is pretty damning.
Mm-hmm.
And either goes to show that there's a very lax system of battlefield command and control, or that they are pursuing a policy to make the situation as bad as they can for the population as fast as they can, and remove independent monitors and reporters of various kinds so that the world's eyes and ears aren't there, both of which are obviously bad news for the rest of us.
It really is a shocking realization when you realize that Israel's intentions may have been noble in the beginning in terms of fighting back at Hamas and rooting out any elements of Hamas within the Gaza Strip. But what it seems to have become is much more of a callous eradication of an entire population, 2-point-something million people affected, and enormous famine and other elements. This is not the kind of Israel you expect, but it's maybe the kind of Bibi Netanyahu you expect. And maybe it's time to reassess that man's reliability as a partner for the United States and in the Middle East, because he seems to have a real double agenda going on.
I couldn't agree more. I have commented apropos various reports that Bibi is entirely or mostly now a captive of very right-wing elements in Israeli politics, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, etc. And there are some people who attempt to frame the conduct of the war in Gaza in a way that relieves Bibi of some of the responsibility for it and say this is being driven by others beyond Bibi. My reaction is that this is entirely characteristic and consistent with his policy and beliefs from the beginning of his career. You and I have talked about this in the past, but I think there's every reason to expect that he's as much in support of a territorially expansive objective in this invasion of Gaza as anybody else in Israeli politics. And I think the U.S. government has now been forced to recognize that that's likely the case. It's difficult whether or not Bibi at the helm or others on whom he's dependent for his own political survival. I don't think much matters, because the truth of it is that the war cabinet and the government are pursuing territorial ambitions that are both illegal in international law and anathema to most of world public opinion.
Absolutely. You're very correct in that assessment, in my opinion. I want to remind everyone that the events of October 7th themselves are in great question, because we don't know yet why Israel had so many missteps in its approach to the attack that happened on that day. We know the prime minister took many hours to respond. We knew that other parts of the southern Gaza defense was somehow redistributed to other parts of the West Bank. We knew, or at least now know, that there was a year of advanced knowledge by Israelis, military intelligence at least, about what may happen. Even spotters along the border were able to identify suspicious activity in the weeks leading up to the attack. And yet you still had hours and hours of waiting for an official response by the IDF in what is a fairly small country. On top of that, there's the original statement that he made at the October 7th attack, saying he knew nothing about it. It was all about the being held back by the Israeli security personnel or the leadership of the Shin Bet or Mossad. And then a few days later, he issues this remarkably unnoticed tweet, still an incredible tweet, where he says, "I was wrong. Things I said following the press conference should not have been said. And I apologize for that. I gave full backing to the heads of the security arms, and I'm strengthening the chief of staff and the commanders and soldiers of the IDF who are in the front and fighting for the house. Together we will win." That, to me, seems like one of the most underreported pieces of information in those first few weeks, that the prime minister himself was misleading the world in terms of what he knew and how much responsibility he bore for the events of that day.
Period. It shed a lot of light on what undoubtedly was going on behind the scenes between Bibi and his retinue and security chiefs. I assumed when I read Bibi's statement, my instant reaction, and it remains my belief, is that Bibi's statement reflects pushback and very strong warnings from the security chiefs that if you attempt to thrust the responsibility for this disaster on us, as it appears you are already starting to do, we will push back hard and it will not be good for you.
Mm-hmm. I think it's basically what the subtext of this particular tweet was, but it reminds us that Bibi is not necessarily the most noble of negotiating partners or dance partners in any of these events, and he certainly has been a fixture in American politics for a very long time. I'm reminded by his friendship with Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, in Brooklyn, which is an underreported element as well, but the two of them had a very deep friendship. Do we know if it extended to a friendship with Donald Trump? We don't know for sure, but we certainly know there's an affinity between those two leaders. It was in the first Trump administration, and we may even see it in the run-up into this second attempt at a Trump administration. The fixture of Benjamin Netanyahu as a figure is long in terms of the shadow it's cast in America. Since the 1980s, he's been the United Nations ambassador. When he was first appointed the UN ambassador. And since then, he's never really disappeared. Even as he's been prime minister, he's always had an important dance role with the president of the United States, whether it's Obama or other leaders, but he's never really outside of the United States orbit. And he seems to have made it quite a profession leading American presidents in wrong directions or astray. Yeah, I just think back about the Obama administration in particular, where he clearly was lying to them about what his intentions were with the territories that he was hoping to settle in the West Bank.
I agree with you. I think Bibi, over decades, has persuaded himself that he's a dual citizen and a player in both American politics as well as Israeli politics. I sometimes joke that he thinks he's the governor of the 51st state, and he thinks he has a free hand and every right to play a role in our politics, including going before joint sessions of Congress and denouncing our president and his policies in a way which, if an American president were to do that in the Knesset, I assume would cause an uproar. But Bibi takes it as his birthright, and I don't like it, but I don't know that we can do much about it at this point.
The thing to do about it is perhaps to shed some light on the fact that he's been, manipulating is really the term that comes to mind, the American public for many years. And I found this clip, which was interesting. This is him on Pat Robertson's 700 Club way back in 1990 or 1992. And I'll just play for you his rationale back then for why terrorism exists and who the real people behind the terrorism are. And it's a unique piece of video archive that we've been able to find, and it reveals a lot of think about the way he thinks.
The more we look, the more we found out that terrorist incidents and terrorist groups are not just isolated, random groups around the world, that there is a major force behind most of these groups, and that is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has been arming systematically most of the terrorist groups that operate against the West. They've been training them on its own soil and in countries that are aligned to the Soviet Union. They've been giving them money. They've been giving them diplomatic pouches, safe havens, and so on. If you take away the Soviet Union, its chief proxy, the PLO, national terrorism would collapse. It would cease to be so menacing.
You mean to tell me the PLO, now, on this broadcast the other day, I said the PLO were terrorists. A PLO called us and said, we're not terrorists, we're freedom fighters for liberty and so forth. You're saying that the PLO are the major conduit of terrorism from the Soviet Union.
There have been as early as 1950 camps inside the Soviet bloc, 40 of them in the Soviet Union, that trained terrorists. This was revealed by the Israeli chief of intelligence. But more importantly, the terrorists themselves have spoken in several interviews now that have been filmed and shown in the West of their training in the Soviet Union. Arab terrorists described that there were other terrorists from other countries there. And finally, after this public exposure, the dam burst loose. And in September 29th, 1979, the PLO observer in the UN said, this is all true. The Soviet Union is training and our boys, as they call it, in our military academies.
He admitted it in the United Nations?
Yes, he did. Well, the PBS interview.
That's a shocking interview. Now, let me ask you this. The Saudis are supposedly the friends of the United States, and they're supposed to be Western-oriented, and yet the Saudi Arabia gives $100 million a year to the PLO. Now, Prince Fahd says the reason we do that is so we can have some control over them. If we didn't give any, we wouldn't have any control. Now, how much can you do with $100 million in a terrorist camp?
I think that they're paying basically blackmail money, not having any control whatsoever. The people who control the PLO, if at all, are the Soviets and not the Saudis. What the Saudis are doing is funneling, paradoxically, the main force that operates today outside the organized armies of the Soviet bloc against the Western interests and American interests. And that's the PLO.
What do they plan to do with terrorism? What is the ultimate strategy?
It's to destabilize and to weaken and to terrorize every country in the West, every American interest, every American economic base outside the United States. It's to make America withdraw from various parts of the world and feel that it simply cannot deal with this type of malignant disease that is spreading.
In other words, the kidnapping of General Dozier, the attack on the commanding officer in Germany, all these things are part of a pattern. The Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, the Red Brigade in Italy, these other terrorist organizations are all interconnected and all with one central goal.
There certainly is a great deal of Soviet involvement with all of these groups. And the objective invariably is not to attack Bulgaria. It's not to attack Budapest. It's always American targets or Western targets or what they call the Zionist imperialist conspiracy.
What are your takes on that? I think there's so many interesting parallels there, but let's you pick it apart first.
First of all, I think both those guys were very young.
They do look pretty young. One of them's still, I don't think one of them's alive.
Bibi still had some hair.
Yeah, he looked very, like he still had some vim to his vigor, but yes. Interesting for me, you've got the strategy is the same kind of storytelling about this threat from some foreign source. Nowadays, Bibi is so close to Vladimir Putin that he no longer can blame Vladimir Putin for the same thing he blamed the Soviets for, so now he blames Iran. But truthfully, the rest of it sounds pretty much the same. You could plug out PLO and put in Hamas, and you'd get the same sort of storyline involving Qatar funding Hamas and blackmail money if you want. You'll find the same sort of dynamic between Iran, as he says today, and the Soviets back then, who were trying to play an asymmetrical game against the Americans. Pretty much it's the same thing. We haven't really moved very far, and Bibi is still at the center of this dynamic, which is interesting.
It is an interesting parallel that you point out. His narrative vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and his rhetoric now about Iran as the sponsor for everyone from Hamas to the Houthis. Look, it would be fatuous to deny that there are very real terroristic threats to Israel. It's obviously in Bibi's interest. It was in his interest when, at the time, he was talking with Pat Robertson, and it remains in his interest to present Israel as the sort of beleaguered, beset on all sides champion of the West sitting in a very dangerous neighborhood, because that elicits support from the West and presents Israel in the light which he finds comfortable. Look, the fundamental truth is that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. There isn't much point debating on a sort of semantic level whether it's true that this group or that group are terrorists. But I do think that Bibi has very consistently presented a narrative which has enabled him to assemble and maintain very strong support for Israel, certainly in the U.S. and throughout the West. I think that he's overplayed his hand in the reaction to October 7th. And that's one of the reasons why you see very strong bipartisan support for ceasefire and some kind of a deal that releases whatever hostages remain. But you don't see the sort of reflexive, kick-ass, pro-Israel policy that I've seen at earlier periods. I think that some of the patience with Israel has now run out.
Yes, it does seem like that, and it's rather tragic because Israel is an important partner for the United States in the Middle East, and equally, the United States is an important partner for Israel. And it does seem to me like they've made the calculus, at least Bibi has made the calculus, that they can go without America, that they can do this with the Chinese and the Russians, and that it really is just an acceptable switch to that. And in addition to that switch, maybe there's also an acceptable switch from democracy to dictatorship, which seems to be the road that he's going down.
That is, to me, the most important point to be made in all of this. And I've said this publicly as well, that very special relationship which has existed between Israel and the United States since Israel's founding is rooted in shared values. And if the shared values erode, or if the basis of common set of values starts to erode, then the specialness of the relationship will also start to erode. I've said that it just is unsustainable in the future that we should sail 2 aircraft carrier groups halfway around the world to reflexively support a government which is acting in a way that is inimical to our basic values and principles. And I think that trade-off, or that the consequence of Israel straying from a truly liberal and democratic, little d, way of governing itself, is understood in the political leadership in Israel. I've seen multiple comments from ex-chiefs of Mossad, etc., saying just that if we begin to act in an autocratic way, if we fundamentally disrespect the rights of a block of our citizens and treat them in a way which denies them self-representation and basic human rights, that we can and should expect that the U.S. will react to that, and it will not be good for Israel. And I don't think in saying that I'm saying anything that is foreign to millions of Israelis who are actively in the streets demonstrating, who were in the streets before October 7th over the so-called judicial coup.
Yeah, and I don't know whether I certainly don't get the sense from the Israeli media that they are as aware of the enormous damage that's been done to Gaza. It doesn't seem to resonate internally, domestically, how much suffering has gone on for the 2.3 million Gazans who have been forced to move away from these horrific attacks, who have then demolished their streets and their neighborhoods and their infrastructure and way of life, to now withdraw and allow them back in, but to live in what kind of squalor and in what kind of devastation, with humanitarian supplies only now getting to them after months of very difficult conditions. I don't think Israelis understand that is being viewed in the world as incredibly overbearing and way too much of a response. Still think they're in that state of mind where they think, this is justified and this is what we need to do.
I don't know. You're in a better position than I to assess what the media is presenting in Israel and what people are seeing and absorbing. And I do think that I do pick up that there is a kind of consternation or a failure to understand on the part of Israelis as to why some of the reaction has been going on in the West. I will say that I think for people who are following the news closely, there have been a number of very clear signs that the sort of Ben Gvir, Smotrich elements have their eyes on Gaza as a piece of territory that they'd like to claim. So I think that the war policy, which has effectively been to clear the population, first in the north and then with a threatened assault on Rafah in the south, if you link those military actions with statements by some of those right-wing leaders, as well as with statements by people like Jared Kushner, who has said in the last week, apparently in some seminar at Harvard, where he was involved in a Q&A, that he personally, and now he's speaking as a fund manager with close to $3 billion of money to spend, $2 billion of which apparently came from the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, the PIF. He's saying, hey, this beachfront property in Gaza could be very valuable. There's a tremendous potential here for the development of luxury hotels and resorts, and could be a bonanza. So you put all of those statements together, I'm not at all sure that there isn't at least an element in the decision-making cadre in Jerusalem that isn't thinking, you know what, we've already taken enormous heat over what's happened in Gaza. We might as well just tough it out and take the place. Jared Kushner actually said in the same set of remarks that he thought bulldozing some area in the desert south of Gaza and relocating the entire population might be a good thing or might be doable. So I think we're looking at the possibility of a planned ethnic cleansing and the clearing of the land, which would be heinous and something that, again, the world would not sit still for, I don't think.
And that's an interesting line of questioning you're opening up there. Of course, he has a very famous picture of Bibi and Mr. Kushner are very close to each other. Famously, Bibi Netanyahu used to sleep over at Kushner's house, and Kushner was still a teenager, I believe. And
in Jared's bed.
This really presents a different choice now for November, because the path that the Biden administration is proceeding under is, let's have a two-state solution. Let's give the Palestinians some sort of homeland here in Gaza that will unite them with their brothers in the West Bank. And then on top of that, we'll engage the Saudis in a normalization deal with Israel. And you could rebuild some of those beautiful beachfront properties into hotels, but there would be in a Palestinian territory. The difference between what they're saying and what I believe Jared is advocating and Mohammed bin Salman is advocating, along with what will be a Donald Trump position, I think, ultimately, is what if we do this as Israeli territory, where it's Israeli territory and Israeli developers that build the new facilities there along the beachfront. And we get all the oil, we get all the gas. And thank you very much, Joe Biden, for allowing this period of time for us to realize that we don't really want this two-state solution, and which truly nobody in Israel cares about. This two-state solution is non sequitur for many Israelis because no one there is advocating for it anymore. Are we seeing that kind of fork in the road as we head towards November?
Well, first of all, I've said this many times, the percentage of the American electorate that gives two hoots about any of this is very small. So let's not kid ourselves that this fork, although it may exist, will be in terms of the electoral college and whether Trump ends up as president again or not. Having said that, what obviously is true is that what happens in the Middle East is very important and, as is increasingly clear, has the potential to threaten U.S. national interests, which are no longer, by the way, primarily about oil in that region, and has the capability of spreading and igniting a much broader conflict that would inevitably drag us in. So I think people who are thinking sensibly about how to finally, after so many years, achieve some kind of lasting and sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians, understand that whether you call it a two-state solution or some other form of self-government and self-representation, a solution has got to be found. And that's going to end up irritating or angering some sections of the Israeli public. And for the U.S. to pursue it will require real persistence and strength in moving people off of the positions that they're now on. I think we may have seen the beginnings of some of that in the aftermath of this most recent call between Bibi and President Biden, in which it's reported a senior Israeli official was screaming. I presume that was Bibi at some point, just losing it. But we have seen afterwards the opening of the Eretz portal into Gaza and the movement of significantly enlarged aid supplies and other things. Whether it's for good or ill, I do think that Lincoln, Biden, Sherman, and the rest of the team have decided that we've had it with Middle East wars. This thing keeps coming up and biting us. We've had problems all throughout the region. It never gets us very far. And now it's even less sensible than before when we're less and less reliant on Saudi and UAE and Qatar oil supplies. We need to fix it. And I think they're going to push very hard. The support which Biden has given to the Israelis in the aftermath of October 7th has earned him real scorn. He's paid a major price in terms of some segments of popular opinion here and elsewhere. But it has also earned him, I postulate, it has earned him some goodwill as a defender of Israel, which will be to his credit when he has to say to the leadership of Israel and to the Israeli people at whatever moment it's right to say it, this is a bitter pill that you've got to swallow. This is the only way that we will have peace in the region. Palestinians can no longer be ridden roughshod over in the way that prior to October 7th, I think some Israelis had basically persuaded themselves that problem with the segregation of the populations and the walls and the checkpoints, et cetera, that it was a workable solution, and Iron Dome protected the country anyway, and everybody had blinders on and thought that the problem could be ignored. The problem can no longer be ignored.
So let me push back a little bit on what you said earlier on about this not affecting the electorate. Come November, we will have a choice between Trump and Biden, who will, I think, have two different differentiatable viewpoints on what might happen in Israel. And I also think we might have a hostage crisis going on. And it doesn't take one very long to think about. Last time we had a big hostage crisis, and maybe a few times ago, not particularly the exact last one. And one thinks back to 1980, and one thinks back to Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and here's a little bit of tape from ABC News back then, which really sets the stage for what we could see again.
Now, day one of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and day one of freedom for 52 Americans. Though thousands of miles apart, these two historic events moved almost on parallel tracks today. The new president had not been in office an hour when the former hostages became free men and women again. And they are well along now on their trip to West Germany and eventually to home. For the latest on their return to freedom, in this country, the command post, as often, a time of crisis, the Oval Office of the White House. We have a report from Barry Dunsmore.
It wasn't the first time that top Carter administration officials had spent sleepless nights in the Oval Office over Iran. But no matter what, it would be their last. This one had a different ending.
Mr. President, Secretary Miller.
All right.
Who is your... Hello? Kelly? Right on, man. That's great. Okay, now the next step then. So that'll go. So that'll go to Algiers, and Algiers, when they notify Iran, will notify us back, right?
Later this morning, after word was received that Iran had taken all the necessary steps to make the transfer of its assets possible, Mr. Carter could relax even more, although there was always the nagging doubt. It wasn't until the motorcade on their way to the capital that the president was able to tell the president-elect that the hostages were aboard planes and would be airborne in 15 or 20 minutes. But it would be longer. Finally, just before Mr. Carter got to Andrews Air Force Base for his trip home to planes, the hostages' departure was officially confirmed. They had taken off about a half an hour after he was no longer president. The timing could hardly have been accidental.
Timing could hardly have been accidental, seems quite the line there. It's now known, many years later, that there was an initiative by the Republicans and Reagan Republicans to delay any deal for Carter and the hostages, and for that timing to be just the way it was intended to be as Carter was leaving the White House and was scoring a victory for Ronald Reagan. And they did intervene, I think, through, the guy's name was Ben Barnes, who's then lieutenant governor, I think, of Texas. There was a clandestine agenda to go to visit these countries, to visit the Middle East countries, and to present an alternative to Carter's initiative, and to present a different deal so Reagan could look good and Carter would look bad, and flip around the victory for. Are we destined to see something like that play out?
I guess maybe. One question is how many hostages remain alive? That's something that is very much in the news and being talked about. Second of all, although there probably are still, if there are any hostages alive, some of them, but a few, are probably U.S. citizens or dual citizens, which would put the U.S. president or president-elect on the spot. But most of them are Israelis. Most of them are, therefore, primarily the responsibility of the Israeli government. I think that the background to the release of those Iranian hostages, of course, included the failed hostage rescue attempt in the deserts of Iran, where U.S. helicopters collided and the mission was eventually abandoned. I think that Israel has by now done militarily everything that it could possibly have done to find the tunnels in which these people are being held or the houses in which they're being held. I can't imagine that there's, in terms of a hostage rescue crisis, I can't imagine there's any stone unturned from the Israeli side at this point. I go back to what I said, which is, and which you were trying to push back on, which is these issues are very important to us and in absolute terms, a fairly large number of Americans, but in electoral terms, Carter was undoubtedly harmed politically by the appearance or the impression that he had been outwitted and that he was showing weakness or impotence, American weakness, at a time when it was our citizens who had been taken from our embassy and were being held by people whose most common chant was death to America. There's nothing like that around this current hostage situation, I think, that would damage as much as Carter clearly was, either Biden or Trump. I think what Biden is handling, what had damaged him in some categories of voters, is the impression that he has given unwanted or unwarranted or excessive support to Israel and a blank check to Bibi Netanyahu and the IDF in conducting what I think is now widely understood to have been a disproportionate and excessive military response. He will pay a price for that with some people. If he had done the opposite, if he had gone hammer and tongs at the IDF and Bibi, people have asked for suspension of U.S. military supplies, the immediate withdrawal of the IDF, unilaterally declared ceasefire, etc. If he had done any of those things earlier, I think he would have paid an even larger price electorally in the U.S., which is, we shouldn't kid ourselves, part of the calculus around which decisions are now being made. In 2024, it's an election year. Jewish Americans are a very small percentage of the population, but influential, particularly in the Democratic Party. They have their own range of opinions as to the justification for what Bibi has been up to and whether it's sustainable and justifiable. But I think that Biden has largely ignored the political arena and done what he thinks will deliver us all, including the Israelis, into a, perhaps a decade or more from. I think it's important for people to understand that the diplomatic process that I think is already underway and that will gear up and become more visible in the future is one which is likely to be very arduous and very time consuming and may even transcend the next Biden administration, perhaps the administration of whoever comes after. It's going to be very tough slogging. And Biden is as able as anybody I've seen in this office since FDR to try to pull it together.
He sure does seem like the most capable, certainly in that regard. I just saw a comment of his from the Iranian hostage crisis days when he was a young senator on the Foreign Affairs Committee, commenting about that crisis. He's talked about someone who's actually lived this stuff over and over again. Yeah. Joe Biden certainly has seen the lay of the land more than anybody else. Let me ask one last question, then we can wrap it up for today. The notion that Bibi Netanyahu is pretty much in the Putin camp. You notice he doesn't blame the Soviets or the Russians for being responsible for all these terror groups anymore. He ascribes that blame to the Iranians, but he is very close to Vladimir Putin, and over the years become increasingly closer. They now have a hotline between his residence and Putin's residence in the Kremlin. There's a continuous flow of meetings. There's an enormous number of Russians now living in Israel. In terms of the strongman club, if you'd like to call them that, Bibi is a wannabe participant in that, along with the likes of Viktor Orban and in fact, Donald Trump. And so I see these events sometimes as catalysts that have been set up in a way to help maneuver this next election into Trump's favor. And the same thing for Ukraine, really, is this continuous on the bubble of flipping the other way in Ukraine. And to me, it seems like nothing could be more crystal clear in terms of these battles taking place on the ground. They seem like regional battles, but what they really are is this battle for democracy versus autocracy. What they really are is Putin versus Biden in this, or Putin plus Xi against Biden in this cataclysmic kind of battle we're having about which system of rule gets to continue the world. And to me, that's why these somewhat smaller regional conflicts are turning out to be so much more impactful and more important as we head into this election.
All very astute, I think. I think my only reservation is about the extent to which these local battles are somehow integrally connected and orchestrated at a macro level. I think they are largely local. They do derive from the historical roots of conflicts that are specific to the region, talking now about the Middle East particularly. I don't know much personally about the closeness between Bibi and Putin. I didn't know about the hotline, for example. That all may be true, but I think Bibi is, like Erdogan and others, simply very pragmatic and transactional in aligning himself with people who can do Bibi some favors when he needs them. And he's clearly weakened now. And if Putin is in a position to help Bibi, I'm sure Bibi would be open to that.
For those who are interested, there is a simple graph that I have up, and I'll put up on the site as well, which does trace the history of Israel and Russia and at least the Soviets, and then all the way into what happened once Putin came to power and how much closer Russia has become to Israel since Putin came to power, first with some arms sales and drone sales, but that's really expanded into this hotline and what now Putin calls an unconditional ally, which is quite something to say for Israel when in the past, Zionism was viewed as a bit of a pariah idea in the Soviet Union. They certainly have come a long way, and I think Putin recognizes the strategic value of a pro-Israel leadership, a pro-Russian leadership. And I think the same with probably is the impetus for the judicial review that they've undertaken, along with that. Some of that has come from with Chinese backing and with Russian backing, because it serves the interests of those two countries.
Yeah, very interesting. It also struck me, and I'm sure it struck many others as well, that immediately after October 7th, Zelensky offered or asked to come to Israel to show his support. This is, after all, a Jewish president of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And he was rebuffed. And I think he actually made this suggestion or made overtures on multiple occasions. So it was clear that vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Bibi was not interested in showcasing himself on what Putin would clearly regard as the wrong side of the issue.
And that Putin himself actually invited the the Hamas leadership to Moscow for consultation right after October 7th, in which I think he advised them to which of the hostages to hand over and in which order, and certainly got some payback for that by the Russian hostages being let out first. There seems to be some real communication there between the Kremlin and Hamas. And if that's the case, and there's communication between Putin and Netanyahu, America trying to negotiate some sort of deal between those two polarizing forces might be very difficult. It might be completely impossible at the end of the day.
It is going to be very difficult. It still amazes me. I'm pleased when I do see the occasional reference to the fact that Bibi's policy vis-a-vis Hamas for years was to urge Likud and other elements in the political system to financially support Hamas via Qatar.
Yeah.
And that story is now widely understood and verified. Not much can be said to dispute it. But it's amazing to me that it hasn't been used more forcefully domestically against Bibi. That basically this crisis it brewed on his watch and with Israeli money, and it blew up in his face.
And I wonder sometimes if that's just, if everyone acknowledges that and everyone still wants the same outcome of trying to take over this territory, or a large number of people might secretly want to take over this territory and be gone with that annoying Hamas problem. But that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen realistically. Rick Petrie, thanks again for joining us tonight here on Narrative. I really appreciate your time and your insights as always. It's been a fascinating hour, and I've got a couple of additional things that I did want to share with you, but maybe we can do that on another day as we some other influences around Bibi Netanyahu. But certainly this is one of the big stories to watch heading into the elections in November.
Zev, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a great night.
One day, you'll tell the story of autocrats, crooks, and kings who came for our freedom. A story of citizens who stood up to tyranny and won. The people prevailed and renewed an old vow to a more perfect union. And that was just the beginning. The story continues. Narrative, where truth lives.